It's easy to think that wars begin with shouting, or sirens, or dramatic moments that feel unmistakable. But sometimes they begin much more quietly, through conversations held far away, through lines drawn on maps, and through decisions that were never meant to start a war at all. So as you settle in and get comfortable, let this be a slow and peaceful place to rest. And if you feel like it, you're welcome to leave a comment saying where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Whether it's late at night, early morning, or somewhere in between, tonight, we're going to gently explore how the United States became involved in the Korean War, not through a single clear intention, but through a chain of misunderstandings, assumptions, and quiet choices made in the years after World War II. And we'll move through this story slowly, calmly, and without rushing, allowing the history to unfold at an easy pace as you relax and let your thoughts drift. Before the Korean War ever began, before borders hardened and armies moved, the Korean Peninsula existed in a quieter, more complicated state, shaped by decades of outside control and long-standing cultural continuity. And to understand how events later unfolded, it helps to gently step back into Korea as it was before the war, when daily life followed rhythms that had little to do with global power struggles. Because for centuries, Korea had been a unified land with a shared language, history, and identity, deeply influenced by Confucian traditions that emphasized family, education, respect for elders, and social harmony. And while internal conflicts and dynastic changes had occurred over time, the peninsula itself remained whole, its people connected by geography and culture, until the early 20th century when larger forces began to intrude more forcefully, especially as imperial powers competed for influence in East Asia. And among those powers, Japan emerged as the dominant presence, formally annexing Korea in 1910 after years of political pressure and military involvement, beginning a period of colonial rule that would last until the end of World War II. And under Japanese control, Korea was transformed in ways that were both visible and deeply personal, as the colonial administration sought to integrate the peninsula into the Japanese Empire through economic restructuring, cultural suppression, and political control. With Japanese authorities overseeing infrastructure projects like railways and factories that served imperial needs, while also enforcing policies that restricted Korean autonomy. And for ordinary Koreans, this era was marked by a mixture of adaptation, quiet resistance, and endurance. As schools were required to teach the Japanese language, Korean history was minimized or reframed, and many Koreans were pressured to adopt Japanese names, all while traditional customs continued quietly within homes and communities, passed down through families, even as public expression became more constrained, and rural life in particular retained its slow agricultural pace, with farming villages organized around seasonal cycles of planting and harvest, while urban areas like So-el, then known as Keijo under Japanese rule, grew more industrial and tightly controlled. And despite these changes, the idea of a unified Korea persisted in the minds of its people, reinforced by shared experiences and a collective memory of independence that had not entirely faded, especially among intellectuals, students, and activists who dreamed of self-rule, some organizing protests like the March 1st movement of 1919, which was met with harsh repression but also demonstrated a widespread desire for independence. And although these movements did not succeed in ending colonial rule, they planted seeds of national consciousness that would later influence post-war politics. And as the decades passed, many Koreans found themselves caught between survival and resistance, navigating a world where open opposition was dangerous, but quiet resilience was possible. And when World War II erupted in the late 1930s and expanded across Asia, Korea became further entangled in Japan's war effort, with resources extracted to support the military and many Koreans conscripted into labor or military service, experiences that added layers of trauma and disruption to an already difficult colonial existence. Yet even amid hardship, everyday life continued in small, human ways, with families gathering for meals, elders telling stories, and children growing up knowing their homeland as one place, not two. And this sense of unity is important to remember, because when the war ended in 1945, the division that followed would come suddenly and without deep roots in Korean society itself. And as Japan's defeat approached, Koreans anticipated liberation and the return of self-governance, not realizing that decisions made far away would soon reshape their future. Because the end of World War II arrived rapidly after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japan's surrender, creating a moment of transition that unfolded faster than many governments had prepared for. And in this hurried environment, the fate of Korea became a logistical question rather than a deeply considered national issue, especially for American officials who had limited knowledge of Korean history and internal politics. And while Koreans celebrated the collapse of Japanese rule with hope and relief, that moment of freedom was brief and uncertain, as Soviet forces moved into the northern part of the peninsula while American forces prepared to enter the south, setting the stage for a division that was never part of Korea's own long-term vision. And yet at this early stage, few people imagined permanent separation or war, because the peninsula had always been one, and most assumed it would remain so. And this assumption, shared by ordinary citizens and many leaders alike, would later collide with the realities of Cold War politics. But for now, Korea, before the war, can be understood as a land emerging from colonial rule, carrying deep scars, but also a strong sense of shared identity, unaware that the choices about to be made on its behalf would turn temporary lines into lasting borders and confusion into conflict, all beginning not with intention but with haste and distance. When World War II came to an end in the summer of 1945, it did so with a suddenness that left little time for careful planning, and for Korea, this abrupt conclusion marked the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter, rather than a clean return to independence, because Japan's surrender created a power vacuum across its former empire and the Allied nations. Particularly the United States and the Soviet Union were forced to make rapid decisions about territories they had not deeply prepared to govern, and Korea was one of those places, distant from Washington and poorly understood by many American officials, who viewed it largely through the lens of logistics rather than history. And as Soviet troops moved swiftly down from Manchuria into the northern part of the peninsula, American leaders realized they needed a way to accept the Japanese surrender in the south before the Soviets occupied the entire country. And this realization led to one of the most consequential yet understated decisions of the post-war era, a decision made not in Korea but in a hurried office setting in Washington, where two relatively junior American officers were tasked with proposing a dividing line that could be quickly communicated and easily recognized, and working with a map that offered little detail, they selected the 38th parallel, largely because it split the peninsula roughly in half and placed Seoul within the American zone, a choice driven by convenience rather than deep strategic intent. And at the time, this line was seen as a temporary administrative measure, not a permanent border, something that would allow the two Allied powers to manage the surrender of Japanese forces until a unified Korean government could be established. And importantly, no Koreans were consulted in this process, not because of deliberate exclusion, but because the decision was made so quickly and with so little expectation of long-term consequence. And when the Soviets agreed to this arrangement, the division was formalized almost overnight, transforming a line on a map into a lived reality for millions of people. And yet in those early days, the atmosphere was not one of impending war, but of cautious optimism mixed with confusion, as Koreans in both the North and the South welcomed the end of Japanese rule and hoped that foreign involvement would soon give way to self-determination. And American troops arriving in the South were often greeted as liberators, even though they themselves had limited instructions and little cultural understanding of the society they were now overseeing. And in the North, Soviet forces took a different approach, quickly working with local communist groups that had been active during the resistance against Japan. And while these early interactions differed in style and ideology, both sides initially spoke in terms of temporary stewardship rather than permanent division, and the idea of a unified Korea under an independent government remained widely accepted, at least in principle. But as months passed, the temporary arrangements began to solidify in subtle ways, as each occupying power introduced its own administrative systems, political allies, and economic pole, ICES, and the line at the 38th parallel, once a simple marker of responsibility, became harder to cross, disrupting families, trade routes, and social networks that had existed for generations. And for ordinary Koreans, this period was deeply unsettling, as people who had lived under one system for decades now found themselves navigating unfamiliar authorities, languages, and expectations. And while many tried to adapt, others grew increasingly anxious about the future, sensing that the presence of two powerful foreign militaries might not resolve itself quickly or peacefully. And on the American side, policymakers were juggling multiple global concerns, from rebuilding Europe to managing relations with the Soviet Union and Korea. Lacking the industrial base or immediate strategic value of other regions remained a secondary priority, which meant that long-term planning for Korean governance was often postponed or delegated. And this lack of focus contributed to a growing disconnect between American intentions and Korean realities. Because while American officials spoke of eventual independence, they also feared the spread of communism, a concern that grew sharper as relations with the Soviet Union deteriorated elsewhere, and this tension began to influence decisions in Korea, shaping who was supported politically and how authority was exercised. And in the North, Soviet backing helped elevate leaders who aligned with communist ideology, most notably Kim Il-sung, who presented himself as a nationalist as well as a revolutionary, while in the South, American authorities, state, struggled to find stable leadership, often relying on figures who were anti-communist but not always broadly popular. And these choices, made under pressure and uncertainty, gradually pulled the two halves of the peninsula in different directions, even as official statements continued to emphasize reunification. And by the time discussions turned toward holding elections to form a Korean government, disagreements between the United States and the Soviet Union had deepened to the point where cooperation became difficult, with each side suspecting the other of trying to dominate the peninsula. And when the United Nations proposed nationwide elections, the Soviets refused to allow them in the North, citing concerns about fairness and foreign influence, a move that effectively ensured that separate governments would emerge. And while this outcome was not initially planned, it flowed naturally from the earlier decision to divide administrative control, a decision made quickly and without malicious intent, yet heavy with consequence. And for Koreans watching these developments, the sense of lost agency was profound, as the promise of liberation gave way to a new form of uncertainty, and the realization slowly dawned that the temporary line might become something more enduring. And although violence had not yet erupted into full-scale war, the groundwork was being laid through misunderstandings, competing ideologies, and the quiet solidification of a division that had begun as a matter of convenience, illustrating how the end of one global conflict can sometimes plant the seeds of another, not through deliberate aggression, but through haste, distance, and the assumption that short-term solutions will naturally resolve themselves over time. As the months following the end of World War II quietly turned into years, the temporary division of Korea began to take on a more permanent shape, not through a single dramatic announcement, but through a gradual accumulation of administrative decisions, political alignments, and everyday adjustments that slowly reshaped life on both sides of the 38th parallel. And this period saw the emergence of two very different political systems that reflected the priorities and anxieties of their respective occupying powers. Even as many Koreans continued to hope that reunification would still be possible, because in the north, under Soviet supervision, local people's committees that had formed spontaneously after Japan's surrender were encouraged and formalized, giving the appearance of grassroots governance while also aligning closely with communist ideology. And among the leaders who rose to prominence in this environment was Kim Il-sung, a former guerrilla fighter who had spent years in exile and military service under Soviet influence. And he was presented to the Korean public as a national hero who had resisted Japanese occupation, a narrative that resonated with a population eager for figures who symbolized resistance and renewal. And with Soviet backing, Kim consolidated power steadily, overseeing land reforms that redistributed property from landlords to peasants, actions that were popular among rural communities and helped build early legitimacy for the northern government, while at the same time political opposition was quietly marginalized and institutions were shaped to mirror those of the Soviet system, including centralized planning and state control of key industries, and daily life in the north began to change accordingly, as propaganda emphasized collective effort, industrial growth, and ideological unity. And while these shifts were not immediately experienced as oppressive by everyone, especially those who benefited from land redistribution, they marked a clear departure from the pluralistic hopes that many Koreans had held at liberation. And meanwhile, in the South, the American military government faced a far more complex and unstable situation, because unlike the Soviets, the Americans had little experience administering Korea and arrived with limited knowledge of local politics. And, in the absence of a clear plan, they initially retained many Japanese-era administrative structures and personnel, a decision made for efficiency, but one that alienated Koreans who had suffered under colonial rule and expected a clean break from the past. And this choice contributed to widespread frustration and unrest as labor strikes, protests, and political demonstrations became common, reflecting both economic hardship and dissatisfaction with foreign oversight. And American officials, wary of communist influence, often responded by supporting conservative and strongly anti-communist leaders, most notably Syngman Rhee, a long-time independence activist who had spent years in exile in the United States and spoke fluent English, making him a familiar and seemingly reliable figure to American authorities. And while Rhee was committed to Korean independence, he was also deeply authoritarian in temperament and intolerant of political opposition, traits that would later shape the character of the southern state. And as rival political factions competed for influence in the South, the atmosphere grew increasingly polarized, with leftist groups facing suppression and right-wing groups receiving tacit or explicit support. And this imbalance undermined the possibility of a broadly inclusive political settlement, even as the rhetoric of democracy was emphasized. And for ordinary citizens, daily life became marked by uncertainty and fear. As shortages of food and employment persisted in the post-war economy, and political violence occasionally flared, particularly in rural areas and on islands like Jeju, where uprisings were met with harsh crackdowns. Events that deepened divisions within Korean society itself and across the peninsula. The line at the 38th parallel became more than just a boundary between occupation zones, as it increasingly represented two incompatible visions of Korea's future, one aligned with socialist collectivism and the other with anti-communist nationalism, each claiming legitimacy as the true representative of the Korean people. And despite ongoing discussions at the international level about trusteeship and reunification, Trust between the United States and the Soviet Union continued to erode as the broader Cold War took shape, making cooperation over Korea ever more difficult. And when the United Nations became involved, proposing supervised elections as a path toward independence, the process further entrenched division, because elections held in the South in 1948 led to the formal establishment of the Republic of Korea, with Syngman Rhee as its president, while in response, the North declared the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with Kim Il-sung at its head, solidifying the existence of two separate governments, each claiming sovereignty over the entire peninsula. And although neither side initially sought full-scale war, both believed that reunification was inevitable and that their own system was the rightful one, a belief reinforced by propaganda, political education, and the lingering memory of a unified Korea. And this mutual conviction created a tense standoff, as small border clashes occurred along the 38th parallel, incidents that were often localized and limited, but served as reminders of unresolved conflict. And for civilians living near the border, life became increasingly precarious. As movement was restricted and rumors of impending violence circulated, even as daily routines continued out of necessity, and American and Soviet troops gradually withdrew, leaving behind advisory missions and local armies that were trained and equipped but not yet tested on a large scale. And this withdrawal was intended to signal a return of sovereignty to Koreans themselves. But it also removed a stabilizing presence that had, however imperfectly, restrained escalation. And as the late 1940s drew to a close, the peninsula existed in a state of uneasy calm, with two governments, two armies, and two competing ideologies facing one another across a line that had been drawn almost casually just a few years earlier. And this calm was deceptive, because beneath it lay unresolved grievances, miscalculations, and assumptions on all sides, including the belief among northern leaders that the South was weak and unpopular, and the belief among American policymakers that Korea was of limited strategic importance and unlikely to become the flashpoint for a major conflict. And it was within this environment of divided authority, hardened positions, and quiet expectation that the next steps toward war would unfold, not as an inevitable outcome, but as the result of choices made under uncertainty, shaped by ideology, fear, and the lingering hope that force might resolve what diplomacy had not, all while ordinary people continued their lives, largely unaware of how close the peninsula was drifting toward open conflict. In the years immediately following World War II, the mindset of the United States was shaped by exhaustion, relief, and a strong desire to avoid another large-scale conflict. And this collective mood deeply influenced how American leaders viewed events unfolding in distant places like Korea, because the war that had just ended was unlike anything the country had ever experienced, having required enormous mobilization, sacrifice, and loss. And when it was finally over, there was a widespread expectation among both the public and policymakers that peace would be lasting, or at least that any future conflicts could be managed without the same level of commitment. And this expectation colored the way American officials approached their new role as a global power, as they focused heavily on rebuilding war-torn Europe through initiatives like the Marshall Plan, stabilizing key allies, and preventing economic collapse that might fuel political extremism, while Asia and Korea in particular remained peripheral concerns in strategic planning discussions, not because they were seen as unimportant in absolute terms, but because American attention and resources were finite, and Europe felt more familiar, more immediately connected to American interests, and more central to the emerging rivalry with the Soviet Union. And as a result, Korea was often discussed in abstract terms, as a location on a map rather than a society with its own internal dynamics. And this abstraction led to assumptions that underestimated both the depth of political division within Korea and the potential consequences of disengagement. And within Washington, debates about foreign policy were increasingly shaped by the early stages of the Cold War, as tensions with the Soviet Union hardened over issues like Eastern Europe, nuclear weapons, and ideological influence. And while these tensions were real and growing, they did not initially translate into a belief that every contested region would become a battlefield, because many American leaders still hoped that spheres of influence could be managed through diplomacy and limited commitments, and Korea, lacking the industrial capacity or symbolic weight of Germany or Japan, did not appear to be a likely candidate for major confrontation, and this perception was reinforced by intelligence. Assessments that portrayed the South Korean government as fragile and the North Korean military as relatively limited in capability, leading to a sense that any conflict on the peninsula would be localized and short-lived, if it occurred at all, and this sense of distance was both geographical and psychological, as Korea lay thousands of miles from American shores and received little sustained attention in the media, which meant that public awareness of Korean affairs was minimal, and without public pressure to prioritize the region, policymakers were free to make decisions based on broad strategic frameworks rather than detailed local knowledge. And this gap between strategy and reality became increasingly significant as the United States began to define its global role in opposition to communism. Because while the Truman administration articulated a policy of containment aimed at preventing the spread of Soviet influence, it also recognized the practical limits of American power and sought to avoid overextension, and this balancing act required judgments about where to draw firm lines and where to accept ambiguity. And in this context, Korea fell into a grey area, a place where American values and interests were present but not clearly defined, and this ambiguity was reflected in the level of support provided to South Korea, which included economic aid and military training, but stopped short of explicit security guarantees, and American advisors worked with the South Korean military to build capacity, but they were cautious about providing heavy weaponry that might encow rage offensive action, reflecting a concern that local conflicts could escalate unpredictably. And at the same time, American officials were increasingly frustrated with the authoritarian tendencies of Syngman Rhee, whose insistence on reunification through force clashed with Washington's preference for stability, and this tension further complicated decision-making, as supporting South Korea required navigating a relationship with a leader who was both an ally and a liability, and these complexities contributed to a broader sense of disengagement, as American leaders hoped that time and international processes would resolve Korea's internal divisions without requiring decisive intervention, and this hope was not entirely unreasonable given the recent establishment of the United Nations and the belief that collective security mechanisms might prevent unilateral aggression. But it also rested on assumptions about rational behavior that did not fully account for the motivations of regional actors. And as the American military demobilized rapidly after World War II, reducing troop levels and shifting resources back to civilian life, the capacity to respond quickly to new crises diminished, reinforcing the desire to avoid commitments that might require renewed mobilization. And this domestic context mattered greatly, because political leaders were acutely aware of public fatigue and the difficulty of justifying further sacrifices so soon after a devastating war. And this awareness influenced how threats were evaluated and communicated, often leading to cautious language and understated assessments, and when combined with limited intelligence and cultural understanding, it created an environment in which warning signs could be overlooked or discounted, not out of negligence, but out of a sincere belief that major conflict was unlikely. And this belief was further strengthened by the assumption that the Soviet Union, having suffered immense losses during the war, would be cautious about provoking confrontation with the United States, an assumption that seemed reasonable at the time, but did not fully account for the autonomy of regional allies like North Korea, and within this framework, Korea appeared as a secondary theatre, a place where American involvement was provisional and subject to revision, rather than a core component of national security. And this perception influenced not only policy decisions, but also the messages sent, intentionally or not, to other actors watching closely, because when commitments are ambiguous, they invite interpretation, and in the late 1940s, North Korean leaders, along with their Soviet and Chinese counterparts, were carefully observing American actions and statements for clues about how far the United States was willing to go to defend South Korea, and the lack of a clear, unequivocal commitment contributed to a sense that the peninsula lay outside the primary defensive perimeter of American power, a perception that would later play a critical role in decision-making. And yet, from the American perspective, this ambiguity was a pragmatic response to uncertainty, an attempt to balance ideals with limitations, and to avoid locking the nation into obligations that might prove unsustainable. And this approach was consistent with a broader post-war strategy that prioritized flexibility and gradual engagement over rigid alliances in less central regions. And while this strategy had its logic, it also meant that Korea existed in a kind of strategic limbo, neither fully protected nor entirely abandoned. And for the people living there, this translated into a fragile peace, sustained more by inertia than by mutual agreement. And as the world moved further into the Cold War, the gap between American intentions and Korean realities widened, setting the stage for misinterpretations that would soon have profound consequences. Because when a nation is distracted, weary, and focused elsewhere, it may fail to notice how its silence or hesitation is perceived. And in the case of Korea, this distracted mindset would prove to be one of the quiet but decisive factors that allowed a localized conflict to escalate into a full-scale war. Not because the United States sought such an outcome, but because it did not fully anticipate how its post-war priorities and assumptions would be read by others in a world already growing more divided and uncertain. As the late 1940s continued to unfold, the broader global tension between the United States and the Soviet Union slowly expanded beyond Europe and settled into Asia in a quieter, less clearly defined way. And this shift marked the moment when the Cold War, still new and not yet fully understood, began to shape events on the Korean peninsula, even though few PEL at the time would have described it in such terms. Because unlike Europe, where borders, alliances, and memories of recent fighting made ideological divisions obvious, Asia presented a more complex landscape of decolonization, civil wars, and nationalist movements, many of which did not fit neatly into American or Soviet expectations, and Korea was very much part of this complexity, emerging from decades of colonial rule at the same moment that two global powers were beginning to see the world through opposing ideological lenses. And, for American policymakers, communism was increasingly viewed as a unified and coordinated threat directed from Moscow, even though in reality, communist movements often had strong local roots and motivations. And this tendency to see global patterns sometimes obscured local realities, particularly in places like Korea, where nationalism, social reform, and ideological alignment were deeply intertwined. And in the North, the Soviet Union's support for a communist government was consistent with its approach elsewhere, but it was also shaped by geographic proximity and historical concerns about security. While in the South, the United States sought to encourage a government that would resist communism without fully committing to long-term military defense, a balancing act that reflected uncertainty about how deeply the peninsula should be integrated into American strategic planning. And as the Cold War intensified through events like the Berlin blockade and the formation of rival alliances, these developments influenced how leaders interpreted actions and intentions far beyond their immediate context. And Korea became one of many places where local disputes were increasingly viewed as potential tests of global resolve, even if they had not started that way. And this shift in perspective mattered greatly because it changed how information was filtered and decisions were made. With ambiguous events taking on greater significance as symbols rather than being evaluated solely on their own merits, and on the Korean peninsula, this meant that border skirmishes, political speeches, and military exercises were no longer just internal matters, but signals that might be interpreted by outside powers as indications of strength or weakness. And within this environment, both Korean governments sought international recognition and support, presenting themselves as legitimate representatives of the entire nation and portraying the other as an illegitimate regime imposed by foreign influence. And this mutual rejection left little room for compromise, especially as propaganda on both sides emphasized reunification as a central goal, reinforcing the idea that division was temporary and that eventual consolidation was inevitable. And while these claims were often framed in ideological terms, they also reflected a genuine belief among many Koreans that their country should not remain divided, a belief that made the status quo feel unstable and incomplete. And for leaders like Kim Il-sung, this instability represented both a challenge and an opportunity, because it suggested that decisive action might be justified as a means of restoring national unity, especially if external conditions appeared favourable. And those conditions were shaped not only by developments in Korea, but by broader changes in Asia, including the Chinese Civil War, which culminated in the victory of communist forces under Mao Zedong in 1949, an event that had a profound psychological impact on American policymakers, who now saw communism spreading across the region, and this perception reinforced fears of a domino effect, even though the concept itself was not yet fully articulated. And at the same time, the establishment of the People's Republic of China altered the strategic calculus for communist leaders, providing a powerful regional ally and shifting the balance of power in East Asia. And for North Korea, this development offered reassurance that support might be available if conflict arose, even as it introduced new complexities into relations with both Moscow and Beijing. And while the Soviet Union remained cautious about provoking direct confrontation with the United States, it also recognized the value of expanding its influence through allied states, and this recognition led to a careful evaluation of opportunities that might advance strategic interests without triggering immediate retaliation. And Korea, divided and unsettled, appeared to be such a place. And on the American side, the response to these developments was uneven, as policymakers struggled to integrate new information into existing frameworks. And although the victory of communism in China heightened concerns, it did not immediately translate into a reassessment of Korea's importance, partly because the two situations were seen as distinct, and partly because American leaders were reluctant to expand commitments so soon after the war. And this reluctance was reinforced by budget constraints and domestic political pressures, which favoured limited engagement over open-ended obligations. And as a result, Korea remained a secondary theatre in American strategic thinking, even as its symbolic significance increased. And this disconnect between perception and policy created space for misinterpretation, because while American officials may have believed they were signalling caution and restraint, others might interpret the same signals as indifference or weakness. And in international politics, such interpretations can have far-reaching consequences. And this was particularly true in the early Cold War, when lines of communication were limited and mutual suspicion was high, and each side tended to assume the worst about the other's intentions. And within this atmosphere, the idea of containment became more rigid, and actions were increasingly evaluated based on how they might affect credibility rather than immediate outcomes. And yet, in Korea, containment was never clearly defined, leaving room for differing assumptions about what the United States would or would not do in response to aggression. And this ambiguity was compounded by public statements and policy documents that emphasized priorities elsewhere, suggesting that the Korean peninsula lay outside the core defensive perimeter, even if it remained of concern. And these statements were closely read by foreign observers, including North Korean and Soviet officials, who sought to discern where American resolve ended and flexibility began. And while American leaders may not have intended to draw a sharp line, the absence of explicit guarantees created a space in which others could believe that decisive action might go unanswered. And this belief did not emerge suddenly or uniformly, but developed gradually as part of a broader assessment of the international environment. And it was reinforced by the relative weakness of the South Korean military, which lacked heavy armor and air power and appeared ill-prepared for sustained defense. And for North Korean planners, these factors suggested that reunification through force might be achievable quickly before the United States could respond decisively. And this calculation was not solely based on ideology, but on a pragmatic reading of the balance of forces and the perceived priorities of the great powers. And from the American perspective, these same conditions were often viewed as manageable risks rather than imminent threats, because the possibility of a full-scale invasion did not align with prevailing assumptions about rational behavior in the Cold War, where it was believed that overt aggression would be deterred by the risk of escalation. And this belief underestimated the extent to which regional actors might pursue their own objectives within the constraints of superpower rivalry. And, as the Korean peninsula settled into this uneasy equilibrium, the absence of war was maintained less by mutual understanding than by competing assumptions, each side believing that the other would ultimately refrain from drastic action. And this mutual miscalculation created a fragile peace, one that could be disrupted by changes in perception as much as by changes on the ground. And in this sense, the Cold War's arrival in Asia was not marked by a single event, but by a gradual shift in how decisions were made and interpreted, a shift that turned Korea into a testing ground for ideas about power, resolve, and credibility, even though the people living there continued to experience daily life in ordinary terms, working, raising families, and navigating shortages and political pressures, largely unaware of how their country had become entangled in a global rivalry that would soon erupt into open conflict. And it was within this complex and quietly intensifying context that the final misread signals would take shape, setting the stage for a war that neither side publicly declared inevitable, yet both increasingly prepared for in ways that made its outbreak more likely with each passing month. In the period leading up to the summer of 1950, one of the most important and least dramatic elements shaping the path toward war on the Korean peninsula was the quiet accumulation of signals that were misunderstood, minimized, or simply interpreted differently by the various actors involved. Because unlike wars that erupt after clear ultimatums or public declarations, the Korean War emerged from a landscape filled with partial information, cautious statements, and assumptions layered upon assumptions. And this environment made it difficult for any single decision-maker to fully grasp how close events were drifting toward open conflict. And for American officials in particular, the challenge lay in distinguishing between routine instability and genuine warning signs, because Korea in the late 1940s was already marked by political unrest, border incidents, and rhetorical hostility, all of which made it hard to identify which developments represented a meaningful escalation rather than a continuation of the status quo. and intelligence reporting during this time reflected that ambiguity. As field reports noted, increased military training and organization in the north, but often framed these observations in cautious language that avoided definitive conclusions, partly because analysts were wary of overstating threats in a climate where exaggerated warnings could undermine credibility, and partly because available information was fragmented and uneven, relying on limited surveillance, informants, and diplomatic observation rather than comprehensive intelligence networks. And this limitation mattered greatly, because while North Korea was indeed building a more capable and disciplined military force, complete with armor, artillery, and Soviet-style organization, the scale and intent of this build-up were not always clearly conveyed to policymakers in Washington, where competing priorities and bureaucratic filters further diluted the urgency of such reports. And within the American military advisory mission in South Korea, there were officers who expressed concern about the I-M balance of forces across the 38th parallel, noting that the South Korean army lacked heavy weapons and was primarily trained for internal security rather than external defense. But these concerns often remained confined to internal memoranda rather than shaping high-level policy, in part because they conflicted with broader assumptions that the peninsula was unlikely to become the site of major conflict, and at the same time, South Korean leaders, particularly Syngman Rhee, frequently warned of an impending invasion, urging the United States to provide more military support and to take a firmer stance. But these warnings were often discounted because Rhee was known for his confrontational rhetoric and his own desire to reunify Korea by force, leading American officials to view his statements as politically motivated rather than as objective assessments. And this skepticism, while understandable, had the unintended effect of blurring the distinction between alarmism and legitimate concern, making it harder to recognize when the risk had genuinely increased. And on the northern side, Kim Il-sung and his advisors were carefully observing American behavior, looking for signs of resolve or hesitation, and they paid close attention not only to official policy statements, but also to the level of material support flowing to the south, the pace of American troop withdrawals, and the tone of public discourse in the United States. And from their perspective, these indicators suggested that Korea occupied a relatively low position in American strategic priorities, especially compared to Europe and Japan, and this perception was reinforced by the limited military assistance provided to South Korea, which seemed to indicate that Washington was unwilling to commit to defending the peninsula in the event of a major conflict. And while American officials may have viewed this restraint as a way to prevent escalation or discourage offensive action by the South, it was interpreted differently in the North, where it appeared to signal a lack of commitment, and this divergence in interpretation illustrates how the same action can convey opposite messages depending on context and expectation. And the problem was compounded by the broader international environment, in which diplomatic communication between the United States and the Soviet Union had become increasingly strained, reducing opportunities for clarification or reassurance. And while Soviet leaders maintained a cautious approach to direct confrontation, they were also interested in expanding their influence through Allied states, and they closely monitored American reactions to events elsewhere, such as the communist victory in China and the response to unrest in other regions, to gauge how far they could push without triggering a forceful response. And in this environment, ambiguity became a strategic factor rather than a temporary condition, and North Korean leaders believed that if they acted quickly and decisively, they could achieve reunification before the United States could mobilize an effective response, a belief that rested on the assumption that Washington would be reluctant to re-enter a major war so soon after World War II, especially in a region that had not been explicitly identified as vital to American security. And this assumption was not irrational given the available evidence, but it underestimated the extent to which American leaders would view an invasion as a challenge to international norms and to the credibility of the United Nations, which had only recently been established as a mechanism for collective security, and yet even this factor was not clearly communicated in advance, leaving room for miscalculation. And within the United States, discussions about Korea were often framed in terms of stability rather than deterrence, focusing on economic aid, political development, and gradual normalization, rather than on preparing for the possibility of sudden aggression. And this framing influenced how intelligence was interpreted, with analysts more likely to view warning signs as indicators of internal consolidation or defensive preparation rather than as precursors to invasion. And this tendency was reinforced by the absence of clear triggering events, because border clashes and skirmishes, while frequent, had become part of the background noise of division, and without a dramatic escalation, it was easy to assume that tensions would continue at a low level indefinitely. And even when reports suggested that North Korean forces were concentrating near the 38th parallel, these movements were sometimes explained as exercises or as posturing intended to extract concessions, rather than as preparations for a full-scale assault. And this interpretive bias reflects a broader human tendency to normalize ongoing risks, particularly when acknowledging their full implications would require difficult choices or disruptive action. And at the same time, the South Korean government's own behavior added to the confusion, because its forces also engaged in border incidents and occasionally crossed the 38th parallel in limited operations, actions that blurred the distinction between defense and provocation and made it harder for outside observers to assign clear responsibility for rising tensions. And this mutual hostility created an environment in which escalation could be framed as retaliation rather than aggression, further complicating efforts to assess intent. And American officials, seeking to avoid being drawn into a conflict triggered by unilateral action, remained cautious in their assessments, emphasizing restraint and diplomacy even as the military balance shifted. And this caution was mirrored in public statements that avoided strong language or explicit warnings, which in turn reinforced perceptions of ambiguity. And on the Soviet side, leaders like Joseph Stalin evaluated the situation with a mixture of caution and opportunism, aware of the risks of provoking the United States, but also interested in testing the limits of American resolve. And while Stalin's approval was necessary for North Korea to proceed with an invasion, his decision was shaped by his reading of American signals, including the absence of a clear commitment to defend South Korea, the withdrawal of American troops, and public statements that emphasized defensive perimeters elsewhere. And these factors contributed to the conclusion that an invasion might succeed quickly and with limited international response, particularly if it could be framed as an internal Korean matter rather than as an act of external aggression. And this framing was central to the narrative presented by North Korean leaders, who described reunification as a domestic issue and portrayed the southern government as illegitimate, an argument that resonated with the idea that Korea was one nation artificially divided by foreign powers. And while this narrative did not convince everyone, it provided a justification that made action seem more acceptable within the ideological context of the time. And from the American perspective, the lack of definitive proof of impending invasion created a dilemma, because taking strong preventive measures could itself provoke escalation or undermine diplomatic efforts, while inaction risked leaving the South vulnerable. And this dilemma was not resolved in advance, in part because the possibility of invasion remained abstract rather than immediate. And this abstraction allowed policymakers to postpone difficult decisions, trusting that developments would provide clearer signals before action became necessary. And yet history shows that clarity often emerges only after events have already begun, and in the case of Korea, The final weeks before the invasion were marked by a continuation of ambiguity rather than by decisive warning, with intelligence reports noting increased readiness but stopping short of predicting an imminent attack, and diplomatic channels offering little reassurance or alarm. And this environment allowed the final decision to proceed to be made in Pyongyang, with the belief that the risks were manageable, even as the potential consequences were enormous. And when the invasion finally began, it appeared sudden and shocking to those who had assumed that the existing tensions would remain contained, revealing how the accumulation of misread signals and untested assumptions had created a situation in which war could begin without anyone having clearly intended to start one. And in this sense, the Korean War did not emerge from a failure to see any warning at all, but from a failure to agree on what the warnings meant, a failure rooted in distance, distraction, and the human tendency to interpret uncertainty in ways that align with existing beliefs and priorities, all unfolding quietly until the moment when ambiguity gave way to irreversible action. One of the most quietly influential moments in the long chain of events that led to the outbreak of the Korean War occurred not on the Korean peninsula itself, but in a speech delivered thousands of miles away, a speech that was calm in tone, technical in nature, and never intended to provoke conflict, yet one that would later be examined closely for the signals it appeared to send. And this moment centers on Secretary of State Dean Acheson and his January 1950 address to the National Press Club, an address that outlined what came to be known as the American defensive perimeter in the Pacific. And to understand why this speech mattered, it helps to consider the environment in which it was given, because at the beginning of 1950, the United States was still adjusting to its role as a global power in a rapidly changing world, balancing limited resources, public war fatigue, and a growing sense of ideological rivalry with the Soviet Union. And within this context, American leaders were under pressure to articulate clear priorities without committing the nation to obligations it might not be prepared to fulfill. And Acheson's speech was an attempt to do just that, to provide clarity about American strategic thinking while avoiding language that could escalate tensions or imply automatic military responses in every contested region. And in the speech, Acheson described a defensive line that ran from the Aleutian Islands through Japan and the Ryukyu Islands to the Philippines, a line that defined the areas where the United States had a clear and explicit security commitment. And notably, Korea and Taiwan were not included within this perimeter, a fact that at the time did not generate widespread attention in the United States, because the speech was viewed largely as a policy clarification rather than a declaration of intent, and Acheson himself emphasized that regions outside the perimeter were not abandoned, but rather that their security would depend on the United Nations and the collective will of the international community, reflecting a belief in multilateralism and the hope that global institutions could prevent aggression without unilateral action. And from the American perspective, this framing made sense, because it aligned with the desire to avoid appearing as though the United States would respond militarily everywhere at once, a posture that would have been both unrealistic and politically difficult to sustain. And yet, while the speech was carefully worded, it was also carefully read by foreign governments, particularly those with a direct interest in American intentions and in international politics. What matters is often not only what is said, but how it is interpreted. And for leaders in North Korea, as well as for their allies in Moscow and Beijing, the omission of Korea from the defensive perimeter appeared significant, because it seemed to confirm existing assumptions that the peninsula lay outside the core areas the United States was prepared to defend by force. And this interpretation was reinforced by other factors, including the earlier withdrawal of most American troops from South Korea and the limited military aid provided to the South Korean army, all of which together created a picture of restrained commitment. And while American officials may have intended the Acheson speech to emphasize collective security and flexibility, it was interpreted by others as a signal of hesitation, or at least of conditional involvement. And this divergence between intent and perception is central to understanding how the war could begin without a deliberate decision by the United States to invite conflict, because the speech did not encourage aggression directly, nor did it suggest approval of forceful reunification, but it contributed to an environment in which such actions seemed less likely to meet immediate resistance. And for Kim Il-sung, who had been advocating for reunification through military means for some time, the speech appeared to validate his belief that the United States would not intervene decisively, especially if an invasion could be presented as an internal Korean matter rather than an act of external expansion. And this belief was not formed in isolation, but through ongoing consultations with Soviet leaders, who themselves were weighing the risks and benefits of supporting such an action. And for Joseph Stalin, the Acheson speech fit into a broader pattern of American statements that emphasized limits and caution, suggesting that while the United States was committed to defending certain key areas, it was reluctant to extend those commitments indefinitely. And this assessment aligned with Stalin's cautious approach because it suggested that a conflict in Korea might not trigger a direct confrontation between the superpowers, particularly if it unfolded quickly and decisively. And, at the same time, the recent establishment of the People's Republic of China added another layer of complexity, as Chinese leaders were also evaluating American intentions and considering how developments in Korea might affect their own security. And while China was still recovering from years of civil war, the proximity of Korea to its borders meant that any conflict there would have regional implications. And yet, in early 1950, the dominant impression among communist leaders was that the United States was focused elsewhere, especially in Europe and Japan, and that its willingness to fight in Korea was uncertain at best. And it is important to note that this impression was not based solely on the Acheson speech, but the speech served as a clear and publicly accessible reference point that seemed to crystallize a broader pattern of behavior. And for American policymakers, the speech was never intended to function as a green light for aggression, and in hindsight, many would argue that it was misinterpreted because the United States had not ruled out intervention in Korea, and Acheson himself later emphasized that the defense of South Korea would depend on the circumstances and on international response. But in the absence of explicit warnings or guarantees, ambiguity filled the gap. And ambiguity, while sometimes useful diplomatically, can be dangerous when different actors draw different conclusions from it. And this danger was heightened by the fact that communication between the United States and its adversaries was limited and filtered through layers of assumption and mistrust, making it difficult to clarify intentions once perceptions had taken hold. And within the United States, the Acheson speech did not trigger an immediate reassessment of Korea policy, because it was consistent with existing views that prioritized flexibility and avoided rigid commitments. And there was little sense that the speech might be read as an invitation to test American resolve, in part because policymakers believed that rational actors would recognize the risks of escalation and would therefore act cautiously. And this belief reflects a broader tendency to assume that others share one's own priorities and risk calculations, an assumption that often fails in situations where local ambitions and historical grievances play a significant role. And in Korea, the desire for reunification was not an abstract geopolitical objective, but a deeply felt national aspiration shaped by decades of division and foreign domination. And for leaders who believed that time was working against them, ambiguity in American commitments could be interpreted as an opportunity rather than a warning. And as months passed after the Acheson speech, these interpretations hardened influencing planning and decision-making in Pyongyang and beyond. And while there were still debates and uncertainties, the speech became part of the justification for moving forward, a piece of evidence that seemed to suggest that the risks of action were acceptable. And when combined with assessments of South Korea's military weakness and the belief that the population might welcome reunification, the conclusion that an invasion could succeed quickly gained traction. And from the American side, the absence of strong reactions to the speech's international reception meant that its implications were not fully appreciated until after events had unfolded. And this delayed realization highlights how difficult it can be to see the impact of one's words in real time, especially when those words are intended to clarify rather than provoke. And yet history often assigns meaning retrospectively, identifying moments that appear pivotal only because of what followed, and the Acheson speech is one such moment, not because it caused the Korean War directly, but because it contributed to a set of assumptions that made the war seem possible, even plausible, to those considering drastic action. And in this way, the speech illustrates how policy statements, even when carefully crafted, can take on lives of their own once they enter the international arena, shaped by the hopes, fears, and calculations of those who hear them. And as the first half of 1950 progressed, the interpretations derived from this speech merged with other signals and miscalculations, narrowing the space for peaceful resolution and setting the stage for a decision that would soon transform ambiguity into open conflict, not through deliberate provocation by the United States, but through the unintended consequences of words spoken calmly, thoughtfully, and without any expectation that they would help usher in a war that few truly wanted, yet many were quietly preparing for. By the early summer of 1950, the long period of uncertainty, assumption, and quiet preparation finally gave way to action, and on June 25, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in what would become the opening moment of the Korean War, an event that unfolded with speed and coordination that surprised many observers, particularly in the United States, where the prevailing belief had been that large-scale conflict on the peninsula was unlikely, or at least not imminent. And this moment marked the point at which years of misread signals and unresolved tensions became irreversible real. Because the invasion was not spontaneous or improvised, but the result of careful planning shaped by earlier interpretations of American restraint and South Korean vulnerability. And in the early hours of that Sunday morning, North Korean troops, supported by tanks and artillery supplied by the Soviet Union, moved southward across multiple points along the border, overwhelming South Korean defences that were thinly spread and poorly equipped to resist a mechanized assault, and the speed of the advance reflected the imbalance of forces that had developed during the preceding years. As the North Korean People's Army had been trained and organized along Soviet lines with experienced officers and cohesive units, while the South Korean Army, though motivated, lacked heavy weapons, air support, and sufficient coordination. And as reports of the invasion reached Seoul, confusion and disbelief spread quickly, because despite warnings and border clashes in the past, the scale of the attack exceeded expectations, and within hours it became clear that this was not a limited incursion, but a full-scale attempt to reunify the peninsula by force. And for civilians living near the border, the sudden movement of troops and the sound of artillery shattered what had been an uneasy but familiar calm, forcing many to flee southward with little more than what they could carry, while others remained behind, uncertain of what the changing control would mean for their daily lives. And as North Korean forces advanced rapidly, capturing key towns and pushing towards Seoul, the South Korean government struggled to respond, hampered by communication breakdowns and a lack of preparation for such an assault. And President Syngman Rhee's administration faced immediate crisis as the capital itself came under threat, prompting hurried evacuations and difficult decisions about how to preserve continuity of governance, and the fall of Seoul within days of the invasion underscored the severity of the situation, sending shockwaves through the international community and forcing American policymakers to confront a reality they had hoped to avoid, because news of the invasion reached Washington at a moment when the United States was not psychologically or logistically prepared for another war, and initial reactions reflected a mixture of surprise, concern, and uncertainty about how to respond. And yet the framing of the invasion as a clear act of aggression crossing an internationally recognized boundary altered the calculus rapidly, because it challenged not only the stability of Korea, but the credibility of the emerging post-war order, particularly the authority of the United Nations, which had been established in part to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral use of force. And President Harry Truman, along with his advisors, viewed the invasion through this broader lens, recognizing that failure to respond could set a precedent that undermined collective security efforts elsewhere, even as they grappled with the risks of escalation. And this shift in perspective marked a turning point, because while Korea had previously been seen as a peripheral concern, the invasion formed it into a test case for international norms and American leadership. And this transformation happened quickly, leaving little time for extended debate or gradual adjustment, and within days, the United States moved to support a United Nations Security Council resolution condemning the invasion and calling for assistance to South Korea, a process facilitated by the absence of the Soviet Union from the Council at that moment due to a boycott over representation issues, an absence that would later be seen as a critical miscalculation on Moscow's part. And with international authorization in place, the United States began to commit military forces to the conflict, initially providing air and naval support, and then deploying ground troops, decisions that escalated American involvement far beyond what had previously been contemplated. And from the perspective of North Korean leaders, this rapid response came as an unwelcome surprise, because their calculations had assumed a slower and more limited reaction, perhaps involving diplomatic protest or material aid rather than direct military engagement. And this miscalculation illustrates the central theme of unintended consequence, because the invasion itself was based on an interpretation of American restraint that proved incomplete, and once events were set in motion, the space for recalibration narrowed dramatically, and for the Soviet Union, the unfolding conflict presented a complex challenge, as Moscow sought to support its ally without provoking a direct confrontation with the United States, leading to a strategy of indirect assistance rather than overt involvement, while China, newly established and still consolidating its own revolution, watched developments with growing concern, aware that the presence of hostile forces near its borders could have serious implications. And these overlapping interests and anxieties turned the Korean peninsula into a focal point of Cold War rivalry almost overnight. Even though none of the major powers had initially sought such an outcome, and for American forces arriving in the region, the early stages of the war were marked by improvisation and adjustment, as units rushed from occupation duties in Japan to combat roles in Korea, often underprepared and unfamiliar with the terrain. And these early engagements underscored the difficulty of responding to a crisis that had not been fully anticipated, reinforcing the sense that the war was unfolding faster than policy could adapt. And yet, despite these challenges, the commitment deepened, driven by a belief that allowing the invasion to succeed would have consequences far beyond Korea, shaping perceptions of American resolve and the viability of collective security. And this belief, once formed, sustained involvement even as the costs and risks became clearer. And for the Korean people, the invasion marked the beginning of a long and devastating conflict that would reshape their lives in ways few could have imagined during the years of post-war uncertainty, as families were separated, cities damaged, and the familiar rhythms of daily life disrupted by forces beyond individual control. And it is important to recognize that this moment, often described simply as the start of the Korean War, was in fact the culmination of a series of decisions and interpretations made over several years, none of which alone guaranteed war, but together created conditions in which war became possible. And once the first tanks crossed the 38th parallel, those conditions hardened into reality, transforming ambiguity into action and turning a divided peninsula into the site of an international conflict that would draw in multiple nations, alter global strategies, and leave a legacy that endures to this day, not because the United States intended to start a war in Korea, but because the interplay of distraction, assumption, and miscommunication allowed others to believe that such a war could be fought without decisive opposition, a belief that proved tragically mistaken as the world responded and the conflict expanded beyond its initial boundaries. In the immediate aftermath of the invasion, the United States found itself moving from a posture of uncertainty into one of rapid response, not through a long deliberative process, but through a series of urgent decisions made in quick succession, decisions shaped by shock, principle, and a growing realization that events in Korea had suddenly taken on global significance. And this transition is central to understanding why the war is often described as accidental from the American perspective. Because while the United States had not planned for combat on the peninsula, it now felt compelled to act in order to preserve a broader international order that it had helped create after World War II. And at the center of this response was President Harry Truman, who received news of the invasion while attending to domestic matters, and was immediately confronted with the question of whether the United States would intervene directly in a conflict it had previously treated as peripheral. And Truman's initial reaction was cautious but firm, reflecting both his desire to avoid another war and his belief that unchecked aggression posed a serious threat to global stability. And this belief was rooted in recent memory, particularly the lessons drawn from the 1930s, when failure to respond to early acts of aggression in Europe had, in the view of many American leaders, contributed to the outbreak of World War II. And this historical analogy weighed heavily on decision-making, creating a sense that inaction carried risks equal to or greater than intervention. And as advisors gathered to assess the situation, discussions focused not only on Korea itself, but on how the response would be perceived elsewhere, especially in Europe and Japan, where American commitments were clearer and more substantial, and there was concern that allowing South Korea to fall without resistance would undermine confidence in American leadership and embolden other challenges to the post-war order. And within this framework, the invasion was framed less as a regional civil conflict and more as a test of collective security, a framing that made involvement seem necessary even if it had not been desired. And this reframing occurred rapidly, aided by the existence of the United Nations, which provided a legal and moral structure through which action could be taken without a formal declaration of war. And when the United States moved to bring the issue before the UN Security Council, it did so with the intention of sharing responsibility and legitimacy, emphasizing that the response would be international rather than unilateral. And the passage of resolutions condemning the invasion and authorizing assistance to South Korea gave the American response a sense of urgency and obligation, because once the United Nations had spoken, failure to act would have undermined the very institution the United States had championed. And this dynamic illustrates how structures created to prevent war can, in certain circumstances, accelerate involvement once conflict begins. And as military planners work to translate political decisions into action, the challenges of rapid mobilization became clear, because the American military had been significantly reduced since the end of World War II. With forces demobilized and equipment mothballed, in the belief that large-scale conflict was unlikely, and this reduction meant that initial deployments were limited and improvised, relying heavily on units stationed in Japan as part of the occupation, many of which were not fully trained or equipped for combat operations. And these early deployments were intended as a stopgap, a way to slow the North Korean advance while broader plans were developed. But they also reflected the reality that the United States was entering a war it had not prepared for, reinforcing the sense that events were driving policy rather than the other way around. And within the Truman administration, there was ongoing debate about the scope of involvement, with some advisers urging restraint to avoid provoking a wider war, particularly with the Soviet Union or China, while others argued that half measures would only prolong the conflict and increase costs. And Truman himself sought a middle path, authorizing significant military support while carefully framing the action as a police effort under UN auspices rather than a traditional war, a distinction that allowed the United States to avoid a formal declaration of war and maintain flexibility, but also contributed to the perception that the conflict was limited and manageable, an assumption that would be tested repeatedly in the months that followed. And from the perspective of American soldiers arriving in Korea, the rapid escalation was disorienting. As they moved from occupation duties and training exercises into active combat with little warning, often lacking detailed intelligence about the enemy or the terrain. And these early encounters highlighted the gap between expectations and reality, as units faced determined opposition and difficult conditions that underscored the seriousness of the commitment. And yet, even as casualties mounted and the situation remained fluid, the logic of involvement hardened, because each step taken made withdrawal more difficult, and each investment of resources reinforced the belief that success was necessary to justify the costs already incurred, a dynamic that often characterizes conflicts that begin without clear end goals. And at the diplomatic level, American leaders worked to reassure allies and manage relations with adversaries, emphasizing that the intervention was defensive and limited in scope, intended to restore the status quo rather than to pursue regime change or territorial expansion. And this emphasis was particularly important in communications with the Soviet Union, where there was a desire to avoid escalation into a direct superpower confrontation. And while these reassurances were not always trusted, they reflected an ongoing effort to contain the conflict even as military involvement deepened. And for China, the American response raised concerns about encirclement and security, concerns that would later influence its own decisions to intervene, demonstrating how initial actions taken in haste can ripple outward, affecting calculations far beyond their original intent. And throughout this period, the American public was gradually introduced to the reality of the war through news reports that described fighting in a distant land many could not easily locate on a map. And while there was initial support for the intervention, rooted in the framing of the conflict as a stand against aggression, there was also confusion about why the United States was fighting there at all, reflecting the broader uncertainty that had characterized policy before the invasion. And this confusion underscores the accidental quality of the war from the American perspective, because it was not the result of a clear national debate or a deliberate choice to pursue conflict, but of a rapid shift in circumstances that transformed assumptions into obligations almost overnight. And as the weeks passed and the conflict expanded, American leaders continued to grapple with the implications of their decisions, balancing the desire to limit the war against the need to respond effectively to changing conditions on the ground. And this balancing act became increasingly complex as other actors entered the conflict, and the initial goal of restoring the pre-invasion boundary evolved into a broader struggle with uncertain endpoints. And yet, at its core, the American response to the invasion remained shaped by the belief that allowing aggression to succeed would have consequences that extended far beyond Korea, a belief that turned what had once been a distant concern into a central front in the Cold War. And this transformation, driven by reaction rather than intention, illustrates how the United States became deeply involved in the Korean War, not because it sought to start a conflict, but because it felt compelled to respond to one that had begun under conditions shaped by its own earlier ambiguities, distractions, and assumptions, making the war a product not of deliberate design, but of the moment when uncertainty gave way to action and restraint gave way to responsibility, in a world still struggling to define the rules of peace after a devastating global conflict. When historians later looked back on the origins of the Korean War, many struggled with how to categorize a conflict that seemed to arrive without a single clear moment of decision. And this difficulty is why the war is so often described as accidental from the American perspective. Not because the United States was unaware of rising tensions or entirely passive in the years leading up to 1950, but because no single American leader, policy document, or military plan ever set out with the intention of starting a war on the Korean Peninsula, and instead the conflict emerged from a convergence of limited commitments, ambiguous signals, and assumptions that were never fully tested until it was too late to reverse course. And at the heart of this accident was the gap between intention and interpretation, because American policymakers believed they were acting prudently by avoiding explicit guarantees, limiting military aid, and emphasizing international solutions. Yet these same actions were interpreted by others as signs of disinterest or weakness, creating a classic case of miscommunication in international relations, where restraint on one side appeared as opportunity on another, and this gap widened over time as each actor reinforced its own assumptions, with American leaders convinced that caution would prevent escalation, and North Korean leaders convinced that hesitation signaled vulnerability. And this divergence illustrates how wars can begin not through aggressive intent, but through incompatible expectations about how others will behave. And in this case, those expectations were shaped by distance, cultural misunderstanding, and the sheer novelty of the post-war international system, because the world of 1950 was still adjusting to new rules, new institutions, and new power dynamics, and no one had extensive experience managing a bipolar global order dominated by two superpowers with nuclear weapons. And within this uncertain environment, policymakers relied heavily on analogies and recent experience, particularly the memory of appeasement in the 1930s and the belief that unchecked aggression must be confronted early. Yet these lessons were applied unevenly, because before the invasion, Korea was not seen as a clear test of resolve, while after the invasion, it was rapidly redefined as exactly that, revealing how the meaning of events can change dramatically once action replaces speculation. And this shift highlights another accidental element of the war, the way in which Korea's significance was retroactively elevated, turning a peripheral issue into a central front almost overnight. And this elevation was driven less by prior planning than by the perceived need to respond consistently with broader principles, particularly the defense of international norms against aggression. And while this response was understandable, it underscores how the war was shaped by reaction rather than intention, because the United States found itself committed to a conflict whose stakes had been defined only after it began, and this reactive posture influenced both military strategy and political messaging, leading to decisions that were often made under pressure and revised as conditions changed. And from the perspective of American leadership, this constant adjustment reinforced the sense that events were unfolding beyond their control, as each effort to stabilize the situation introduced new variables and new risks. And this sense of momentum is a common feature of conflicts that begin accidentally, because once forces are engaged and credibility is at stake, disengagement becomes increasingly difficult, even if the original objectives were limited. And in Korea, this dynamic was particularly pronounced, because the conflict quickly became entangled with Cold War symbolism, transforming local developments into indicators of global strength or weakness. And this entanglement made compromise more difficult, as concessions could be interpreted as signs of retreat, and at the same time, the American commitment was constrained by the desire to avoid a wider war, especially with the Soviet Union or China, leading to a strategy that sought to balance escalation and restraint, a balance that was inherently unstable, and this instability further reinforces the accidental nature of the conflict, because it reflects a situation in which no outcome was fully intended or anticipated, and each step taken was justified by the need to manage the consequences of the previous one, rather than by a clear vision of the end state. And for the people of Korea, this meant that their country became the site of a struggle shaped by decisions made elsewhere, decisions driven by global concerns rather than local needs. And this disconnect between cause and effect is central to understanding why the war is remembered as a tragedy of miscalculation, because the division of Korea was initially intended as a temporary demonstrative measure. The limited American presence was meant to avoid entanglement, and the ambiguous signals were meant to preserve flexibility. Yet each of these choices, reasonable in isolation, combined to produce conditions in which war became possible. And this combination reveals how accidents in history are rarely the result of a single mistake, but of multiple small decisions that interact in unexpected ways. And this pattern is evident throughout the early Cold War, when institutions were new, communication was limited, and mutual suspicion was high, making it difficult to correct misunderstandings before they hardened into action. And in Korea, the speed of events further reduced opportunities for reflection, as the invasion created an immediate crisis that demanded response, leaving little time to revisit earlier assumptions or explore alternative paths. And once American forces were engaged, the logic of commitment took hold, making withdrawal seem both morally and strategically unacceptable, even as the costs mounted. And this logic transformed what had begun as a reactive intervention into a sustained war effort, a transformation that few had anticipated in 1950. And this retrospective clarity often leads to the mistaken belief that the war was inevitable, when in fact it was contingent on a series of interpretations that could have unfolded differently under other circumstances. And this contingency is what makes the accidental framing meaningful, because it emphasizes that the war was not predetermined, but emerged from human judgment under conditions of uncertainty. And recognizing this does not diminish the responsibility of those involved, but it does highlight the limits of foresight and the difficulty of managing complex international systems. And from an American perspective, the war stands as a reminder that even efforts to avoid conflict can contribute to it if they are not clearly communicated and consistently understood. And this lesson resonates beyond Korea, offering insight into how power, perception, and principle interact in ways that can produce unintended outcomes. And as the war continued and eventually settled into stalemate, the sense that it had begun accidentally lingered, shaping how it was remembered and discussed, often described as a conflict that no one fully wanted, but few felt able to stop once it began. And this characterization reflects the broader tragedy of the Korean War, a war born not from a deliberate decision to fight, but from the slow accumulation of misunderstandings that turned caution into opportunity, ambiguity into action, and a divided peace into a lasting and unresolved conflict whose consequences continue to be felt decades later, reminding us that in international affairs, the absence of clear intention does not guarantee the absence of profound and lasting impact. As the fighting stretched on beyond the initial shock of invasion and response, the Korean War settled into a prolonged and grinding conflict that further illustrated how far events had drifted from anyone's original expectations. Because what had begun as a rapid attempt at reunification and a swift international reaction soon transformed into a war defined by stalemate, endurance, and unresolved purpose. And this phase of the conflict deepened the sense that the war had emerged not from a clear plan, but from a series of reactions layered upon one another, each shaped by the need to respond to unfolding circumstances rather than by a shared vision of how the conflict should end. And for American leaders, this realization became increasingly apparent as early hopes for a quick restoration of the pre-war boundary gave way to a more complex and costly reality. Especially as the conflict expanded beyond the initial objective of repelling the invasion and began to raise questions about whether reunification under a non-communist government was possible or desirable. And this shift in objectives further blurred the line between intention and consequence, because it reflected how goals can evolve in wartime without ever being fully articulated or agreed upon. And on the battlefield, this evolution was mirrored by the movement of front lines that surged and receded, most notably during the United Nations counteroffensive that pushed North Korean forces back across the 38th parallel and advanced deep into the north. An advance that initially appeared to vindicate the decision to intervene, but also introduced new risks, particularly as it brought UN forces closer to the Chinese border, raising concerns in Beijing about security and influence, and this concern would soon lead to Chinese intervention, another development that few American policymakers had fully anticipated at the outset, reinforcing the pattern of unintended escalation that characterized the war. And when Chinese forces entered the conflict in late 1950, they did so with speed and determination, forcing UN troops into a difficult retreat and shattering assumptions that the war could be won quickly or decisively. And this moment marked a turning point, not only in military terms, but in how the war was perceived, because it underscored the limits of American power and the dangers of assuming that local conflicts could be contained without broader regional consequences. And from this point forward, the war increasingly resembled a struggle to avoid defeat rather than to achieve victory, with both sides settling into positions that reflected exhaustion and caution as much as strategic calculation. And as front lines stabilized roughly along the original dividing line, the irony of the situation became clear, because after years of fighting and immense loss, the conflict had returned to something resembling the status quo ante, a divided peninsula separated by a fortified boundary. And this outcome reinforced the sense that the war had been both avoidable and inconclusive, a tragic expenditure of lives and resources without a clear resolution. And for American society, this prolonged stalemate contributed to growing ambivalence about the war, as initial support, rooted in opposition to aggression, gave way to questions about purpose, cost, and end goals. And this ambivalence was reflected in public discourse that often described the conflict as confusing or distant, lacking the clarity of earlier wars and resisting simple narratives of victory or defeat. And this lack of clarity was not accidental, but a direct consequence of the war's origins. Because a conflict that begins without a clear intention is often difficult to conclude with a clear outcome. And this difficulty was compounded by the geopolitical constraints of the Cold War, which limited options for escalation while also constraining possibilities for compromise. And for American policymakers, managing this balance became an ongoing challenge as they sought to demonstrate resolve without provoking a wider war, particularly with nuclear-armed adversaries. And this constraint shaped everything from military strategy to diplomatic messaging, reinforcing the sense that the war was being managed rather than resolved. And at the negotiation table, these dynamics were evident in the protracted armistice talks that began in 1951, talks that dragged on for 2 years as both sides debated issues like prisoner exchanges, and the precise location of the ceasefire line. Debates that reflected deeper mistrust and unresolved ideological conflict. And the length and difficulty of these negotiations further underscored how the war's accidental origins had given way to an entrenched confrontation that was difficult to unwind, because each side had invested too much to accept terms that appeared to concede legitimacy or advantage. And for the Korean people, this prolonged uncertainty was particularly devastating, as communities were divided, infrastructure was damaged, and the psychological toll of continuous conflict weighed heavy, lie on civilians who had little influence over the decisions shaping their lives. And this human cost, while often discussed in terms of statistics and military outcomes, also manifested in quieter ways, such as displacement, disrupted education, and the lingering trauma of living under constant threat. And these effects persisted long after active fighting ceased, shaping Korean society in ways that are still felt today. And from a historical perspective, the stalemate that defined the later years of the war reinforces the argument that the conflict was not the product of a coherent plan, because wars launched with clear objectives often end when those objectives are achieved or abandoned, whereas the Korean War continued largely because stopping it required agreement among actors whose goals and fears were deeply misaligned, and this misalignment was itself a legacy of the war's origins, rooted in miscommunication and assumption rather than deliberate design. And as the armistice was finally signed in 1953, bringing an end to active hostilities without a formal peace treaty, the unresolved nature of the conflict became institutionalized, with the demilitarized zone replacing the 38th parallel as a heavily guarded boundary that symbolized both the cessation of fighting and the failure to achieve lasting reconciliation. And for the United States, the war left a complex legacy, influencing future foreign policy decisions and shaping attitudes toward limited wars, containment, and the use of force under international auspices. And it also contributed to a re-evaluation of assumptions about deterrence and communication, highlighting the importance of clarity in signaling commitments and intentions. And yet, even as these lessons were debated and incorporated into policy, the Korean War remained somewhat overshadowed by other conflicts, often referred to as the Forgotten War, a label that reflects not only public memory but also the discomfort associated with a conflict that defied simple explanation or justification. And this discomfort is tied to the war's accidental quality because it challenges narratives of purposeful action and raises uncomfortable questions about how easily great powers can become entangled in violence without fully intending to do so. And in reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that the stalemate and unresolved peace that followed were not anomalies but logical outcomes of a conflict born from uncertainty, because when wars begin through miscalculation rather than clear intent, they often end through exhaustion rather than resolution, leaving behind boundaries that are maintained by vigilance rather than agreement. And this pattern is evident in Korea, where the absence of a peace treaty continues to shape relations and perceptions decades later, serving as a reminder that the consequences of accidental wars can be as enduring as those of deliberate ones, and that the costs of ambiguity and assumption do not end when the fighting stops, but continue to influence politics, security, and memory long after the last shots are fired, reinforcing the importance of understanding how the Korean War began not as an inevitability, but as the outcome of human decisions made under uncertainty, decisions that gradually narrowed the path toward peace until conflict became the only option left, even as no one had set out with the clear intention of creating a war that would last for years and leave a divided peninsula as its lasting legacy. As the Korean War moved from active fighting into an uneasy ceasefire, the deeper consequences of how the conflict had begun became more visible, because the armistice signed in July of 1953 did not resolve the underlying issues that had led to war in the first place, but instead froze them in place, turning a temporary division into a hardened and enduring reality. And this outcome reinforces the idea that the war's accidental origins shaped not only how it began, but how it ended and how it has been remembered ever since, because the armistice was not a peace treaty, and no formal agreement was ever reached to officially conclude the war, leaving the two Koreas technically still in conflict decades later, separated by the demilitarized zone, a strip of land that is both heavily fortified and eerily quiet, symbolizing the unresolved nature of the struggle. And from an American perspective, this unresolved ending mirrored the uncertainty that had characterized involvement from the start. Because just as the United States had entered the war without a clear intention to fight there, it exited without a clear resolution that could be framed as victory or closure. And this ambiguity influenced how the war was discussed in public memory, often overshadowed by the clarity of World War II before it and the moral urgency of later conflicts, leaving Korea in a kind of historical middle ground, remembered vaguely as a necessary response to aggression, but rarely examined in depth by the broader public. And yet for policymakers, the lessons of Korea were profound, because the war foe rushed a re-evaluation of how the United States communicated commitments and how ambiguity could invite dangerous miscalculations, leading to a more explicit approach in later Cold War crises, where signaling intent became a central element of strategy. And this shift can be traced directly to the experience of Korea, where unclear signals had contributed to an invasion that the United States ultimately felt compelled to oppose at great cost. And in this sense, the war served as a formative episode in shaping American foreign policy, even as it remained emotionally distant for many citizens. And this disconnect between policy, impact, and public memory is itself a legacy of the war's accidental nature. Because conflicts that begin without clear intention are often difficult to integrate into national narratives that rely on purpose and clarity, and for Korea itself, the consequences were far more immediate and enduring. As families remained divided across a border that had once been drawn hastily on a map, with no opportunity for consultation or consent, and over time, the two societies evolved along separate paths, shaped by different political systems, economic models, and external alliances, making reunification increasingly complex, despite the shared history that had once defined the peninsula. And this gradual divergence underscores how the initial decision to divide Korea, made as a temporary administrative measure, became one of the most consequential acts of the early Cold War. Because once reinforced by war and decades of separation, temporary solutions can solidify into permanent structures, and this transformation was not the result of a single deliberate choice, but of cumulative actions that built upon one another, each justified in the moment, but rarely reconsidered in light of long-term consequences. And from the American standpoint, this raises important questions about responsibility and foresight. Because while the United States did not intend to start the Korean War, it played a central role in shaping the conditions under which it became possible, through decisions driven by haste, distraction, and the desire to avoid entanglement. And acknowledging this role does not imply malicious intent, but it does highlight how powerful nations can influence outcomes even when they seek to limit involvement. And this realization has informed later debates about intervention, restraint, and the unintended effects of foreign policy, debates that continue to this day. And for historians, the Korean War serves as a case study in how international systems function under stress, illustrating how institutions like the United Nations can both constrain and compel action, and how collective security mechanisms can draw nations into conflicts they did not initiate. and this dynamic complicates simplistic narratives of blame or causation because it shows how responsibility is often distributed across multiple actors and decisions rather than concentrated in a single moment or individual. And this complexity is part of what makes the war difficult to summarize or explain succinctly, contributing to its reputation as a confusing or forgotten conflict, even as its consequences remain deeply felt. And for the soldiers who fought there, the accidental nature of the war was experienced not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality, as many found themselves deployed to a distant land with little understanding of why the conflict had begun or how long it would last, and this uncertainty shaped their experience, reinforcing a sense of dislocation and endurance rather than clear purpose. And for civilians caught in the middle, the war's origins mattered little compared to its impact, as lives were disrupted and communities reshaped by forces far beyond individual control. And this human dimension underscores the cost of miscalculation, because even when wars begin without intent, their effects are no less real or enduring. And in reflecting on the Korean War decades later, scholars and policymakers alike have returned to the question of how it might have been avoided, examining moments where clearer communication, stronger commitments, or more inclusive planning might have altered the course of events. And while such counterfactuals can never be proven, they serve an important purpose by highlighting the role of choice and interpretation in shaping history, reminding us that outcomes are rarely inevitable. And this perspective is particularly important in understanding the Korean War because it challenges the notion that Cold War conflicts were predetermined by ideology alone, showing instead how local conditions, individual decisions, and misread signals combine to produce outcomes that no one fully intended. And this understanding has relevance beyond Korea, offering lessons for how emerging powers navigate uncertainty and how global systems respond to regional crises, especially in a world where communication remains imperfect and assumptions continue to shape policy. And as time has passed, the Armistice Line has become one of the most stable yet tense borders in the world, maintained through vigilance rather than reconciliation. And this stability, paradoxical as it may seem, reflects a mutual recognition of the costs of renewed conflict, even as the absence of a peace treaty leaves open the possibility of future tension. And for the United States, continued involvement on the peninsula through alliances and military presence reflects both a commitment to stability and an acknowledgement of past responsibility, reinforcing how the accidental origins of the war have translated into long-term obligations. And this enduring presence highlights another consequence of unintended conflict, because wars that begin without clear intent often create commitments that outlast the original crisis, binding nations together in relationships shaped by history rather than choice. And in the case of Korea, this relationship has become a defining feature of regional security, influencing diplomacy, military planning, and economic development across East Asia. And as historians continue to study the war and its origins, there is growing recognition that understanding how it began is essential not only for honoring those affected, but for preventing similar outcomes in the future, because the Korean War reminds us that peace is not maintained solely by good intentions, but by clarity, communication, and an awareness of how actions are perceived by others, especially in moments of transition and uncertainty. And this lesson remains relevant in a world that continues to grapple with division, rivalry, and the challenge of managing power responsibly. And as the story of the Korean War settles into history, it stands as a quiet but persistent reminder that even when nations seek to avoid conflict, the combination of haste, distance, and assumption can still lead to war, and that the consequences of such wars endure long after the intentions that shaped them have faded. leaving behind borders, memories, and unresolved questions that continue to shape the present, inviting reflection on how easily peace can slip into conflict when clarity gives way to ambiguity and caution is mistaken for indifference. As the story of the Korean War gently comes to rest, it is worth slowing down and looking back at the path that led here, not to assign blame or sharpen judgments, but to understand how easily history can turn when decisions are made under uncertainty and when intentions and interpretations drift apart. Because what makes the Korean War so quietly haunting is not only the scale of what followed, but the ordinariness of how it began, with meetings held in offices far away, speeches carefully worded to avoid commitment, and assumptions formed through distance rather than deep understanding. And from the American perspective, the war did not begin with a desire for conquest or even confrontation, but with a hope to avoid entanglement, to let global tensions cool rather than flare. And yet that very hope, combined with haste and ambiguity, helped create the conditions in which others believed force could succeed without consequence. And this pattern is one that appears again and again in history, where restraint is mistaken for indifference and caution is interpreted as weakness, not because either side is acting irrationally, but because each is viewing the world through its own experiences, fears, and priorities. And in the late 1940s, the United States was a nation exhausted by war, focused on rebuilding, and uncertain about how much responsibility it could realistically bear in a world that suddenly seemed very large and very fragile, and Korea, distant both geographically and psychologically, became a place where those uncertainties quietly accumulated, turning temporary measures into lasting divisions and flexible policies into unclear signals. And none of this unfolded in isolation, because the early Cold War was itself an experiment, an attempt to manage rivalry without repeating the catastrophes of the past. And in that experiment, mistakes were inevitable, especially in regions where local histories were poorly understood and global ideologies were layered over deeply rooted national aspirations. And, for Koreans, the tragedy lies in how their long-awaited liberation became entangled with forces beyond their control, transforming hope into division and uncertainty into war. And this human dimension often fades into the background when conflicts are rediscussed in strategic terms, yet it remains central to understanding why the war's accidental origins matter. Because wars that begin without clear intent still carry very real consequences for those who live through them, shaping families, identities, and landscapes in ways that persist long after the last battle's end. And the armistice that halted the fighting in 1953 did not bring closure so much as it brought pause, freezing the conflict in place and leaving questions unanswered, questions about reunification, sovereignty, and responsibility that remain unresolved decades later. And this unresolved ending mirrors the war's beginning, reinforcing the sense that Korea became a battleground not because it was chosen deliberately, but because it lay at the intersection of competing fears and unfinished plans. And from the American side, the war left behind lessons that quietly reshaped policy, encouraging clearer commitments, stronger alliances, and greater attention to how words and actions might be perceived abroad. Yet even these lessons were learned gradually, filtered through subsequent conflicts and changing global conditions, and they did not erase the discomfort associated with a war that defied simple explanation. A war often described as forgotten not because it lacked importance, but because it lacked a clear narrative of purpose or resolution. And this discomfort speaks to a deeper truth about accidental wars. Because they challenge the idea that history moves according to intention alone, reminding us instead that outcomes often emerge from the interaction of many small choices, each reasonable on its own, yet powerful in combination. And in reflecting on Korea, historians have come to see the war not as an anomaly, But as an example of how modern conflicts can arise in a world of rapid communication, incomplete information, and overlapping responsibilities, where decisions made to avoid risk can sometimes create it instead, and this understanding carries quiet relevance today because the conditions that shaped the Korean War have not disappeared, and nations still navigate uncertainty, rivalry, and the challenge of signaling resolve without provoking escalation. And while the specific context has changed, the underlying dynamics remain familiar, making the story of Korea less a closed chapter than an ongoing lesson. And for listeners drifting through this history in the quiet hours, there is something almost meditative in recognizing how human judgment, with all its limits and intentions, can shape events far beyond what anyone imagines in the moment, and how history is often less about grand designs than about the spaces between them, the pauses, the hesitations, and the assumptions that fill the gaps. And as the peninsula remains divided, guarded by one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world, it stands as a living reminder of those gaps. A reminder that temporary lines can become permanent realities, and that conflicts begun without intent can endure through inertia alone. And yet there is also resilience in this story, in the way societies adapt, rebuild, and continue, despite unresolved pasts, finding meaning. In everyday life, even when history leaves questions unanswered. And perhaps that is the quietest lesson of all, that while wars may begin accidentally, peace, even an imperfect one, is maintained deliberately through patience, vigilance, and an awareness of what has been lost and what must be protected. And as this story gently fades into the background, it invites reflection rather than alarm, offering a space to consider how the past informs the present and how understanding can soften the edges of memory. And if you've made it all the way to the end and found this slow journey through history calming or meaningful, you're always welcome to subscribe and join us again, as new stories like this are shared each week, told gently, thoughtfully, and without rushing. So for now, take a breath, let the details drift, and allow the quiet to return as this chapter of history settles into rest.